The ideality of the preceding first pass of a moneyless society masks a fair number of real problems that such a society will face. This piece holds that these kinds of real problems are largely and perhaps completely addressed by the reality of the proper joint carving of local economies, the constraints of basic sustainable resource management, the realities of a moneyless free labor market wherein we know at least roughly the amount of labor required to sustain needs, wants and desires of a society, and the metrics of the hands of labor. Section 12 has a host of subsections, each of which handle the various real concerns folks are likely to have with a moneyless free labor society, utilizing the framework roughly established in the preceding sections. Moreover, these subsections are utilized to further develop the concept of the moneyless free labor society through addressing the various plausible real concerns. Gentler readers ought consider such as successive pass-throughs of the system with specificity given to topics. When woven together as a whole, they help formulate the system. Section 13, Real Benefits of a Moneyless Free Labor Society, and Section 14, Pragmatics of Implementation, will likewise have many subsections utilized towards similar aims. Folks could also understand Section 12 and 13 as something like a cost-benefit analysis, whereby the supposed costs are being addressed and ameliorated, and the supposed benefits are being expounded upon. Among the most prominent, historically relevant, and obvious kinds of concerns, the luxury concern. If everyone has free access to all the goods and services within a local economy, everyone will gravitate towards the most luxurious of the goods and services. Not all luxury goods utilize a lot of resources to produce or maintain, but some not insignificant number of them do. The yacht comes to mind, as does the mansion. There are several answers to this kind of concern, some perhaps more desirable than others. Who really wants them? This kind of answer has a greater impact on other issues of supposed luxury goods that don't really have any meaningful value beyond, say, making one look pretty or supposed monetary value, covered later. But in terms of these kinds of goods, there is a real sober analysis of the situation that holds that people in general are not really looking to have these kinds of goods. Quality housing, good, mansion, not so much. Quality boat, good, yacht, not so much. It's possible that folks could quibble over this point, and it would be quibbling, but I think there are other far more compelling solutions to this concern that also ultimately supply the answer to who really wants them, so I'll leave it there. Basic head nodding of agreement. If we as a society simply agree that such goods are not on the whole desirable for our society, if, that is, we simply agree that since such things cannot be provided for within a moneyless free labor society across the board, they are therefore not desirable kinds of products, then the problem is solved. Understanding that such head nodding of agreement is already what we largely do, and hence that there is nothing particularly strange, novel, unwieldy, or idealistic about this kind of solution to a problem. Of course, nothing really prevents anyone from making these kinds of things. This isn't, in other words, a suggestion of a law that prevents the creation of such things. Rather, it is a suggestion that as a matter of aesthetical ethics we ought not select for or prefer those kinds of things. A common error in thinking is to hold that the light touch of an aesthetical ethical concern be transformed to a law of dictum, as if it were an ethical obligatory kind of concern. Such errors in thinking being a rather significant ethical error, a big bad The questions of luxury goods being, after all, most eminently one of aesthetics and not of obligation. See The Odd Questions of Privilege, A Slight History of Colonialism, for the relevant argument of these kinds of distinctions. How they are made and who is utilizing them, however, differs. Specifically, it is possible, for instance, for a group of people to agree to make such things and utilize them. The question of labor and ownership differ. It's unlikely that anyone is going to convince some other persons to do the labors involved, especially in terms of staffing such things wherein they themselves are not also able to utilize them. What is unclear within that is how many groups of people may actually do exactly that sort of thing, and in requesting the relevant manufacturers to supply the necessary goods and services to build them, it is also somewhat unclear as to if they would do so willingly. After all, some people really do like making exactly those sorts of things. The restraints of such luxury practices likely amount to the relevant renewal rates of the resources used, the limits of the hands of labor that are willing to do them, and the limits of those who actually want such things. These aspects are given greater attention a bit later in this subsection. Restraints of resources. The moneyless model predicated upon local economies that are bioregionally constrained already provides for an intrinsic restraint upon the production of luxury goods. In other words, there are only so many resources available within a bioregion to craft such resource-intensive luxury goods. In particular, this kind of restraint has an advantage over a moneyed society in that within a moneyed society, the concern regarding resources is not really directly tied to the relevant resources. In other words, a moneyed society utilizes money as the resource limit rather than the resources available as the limit. Hence, a moneyed society will indefinitely use resources until they are no longer available, as the concern is technically how much money you got, not how sustainable is the resource use you are proposing, nor even if there is a resource available. Conversely, and somewhat perversely, a moneyed society has a tendency to not create those kinds of things because they are expensive. The manufacturing of these kinds of luxury goods, in other words, may very well have an artificially low limit attached to them due to the supposed costs. Consider, after all, the yacht manufacturers who love their work, who enjoy creating these kinds of things, and would enjoy creating more of them. Alas! They say, only so few can afford them. If, after all, a yacht doesn't really require a lot of resources to create, which it may not, there isn't any particular reason as to why they wouldn't prefer to make more of them. Or to make fewer non-yachts, making more yachts instead. Such again points to the kind of motivational interests of the artists, the craftspeople, the doer of things, to do the things. Likewise for the mansion. See also the points regarding minor yachts and mansions later in this piece. Such also points to the issues within a moneyed society of artificially produced poverty, whereby in terms of real material goods and services, it is arguably the case that those who produce them would prefer to produce higher quality goods and services, but due to simple monetary concerns they cannot. In terms of real materials used, a yacht or a mansion may not be that much more intensive than, say, a good-sized boat or house. Such may have more to do with the amount of time, labor in other words, involved in the crafting of such things rather than raw materials used. The labor's incentives are to produce higher quality, longer-lasting sorts of goods and services, as overall it's less labor and overall it is more rewarding on a professional level. the only stumbling block therein being moneyed concerns. Comparative solution. It isn't as if the current or any preceding systemization of the species, economies, etc., have ever enabled everyone to have access to yachts and mansions. In this sense, the concern is fairly ephemeral. It asks an absurd question as a serious concern. Since everyone can't have it, then the moneyless model doesn't work. Well, by that metric all previous models have likewise failed. Since there is no meaningful differentiation between these systems on this metric, this is not a real reason or rationale to not go with a moneyless society. Labor constraints. This is a rather good solution and answer to these kinds of concerns. Mansions and yachts, the extravagance of the wealthy, in other words, actually require the labor of others to staff and run them. In a moneyless free labor society, if there are no people willing to do such laborious labor for another, then those things simply do not exist. This, of course, undercuts the wealthy in terms of their extravagances, and perhaps they will yell and scream, perhaps they will not. But the point of this rather simple, valid, and elegant kind of response is that such labor is undesirable, and hence those kinds of goods that require extraneous labor are not worthwhile to do. Understand here, by extraneous labor we are not referring to the labor required to create such structures. Rather, we are referring to the kind of labor required to maintain those kinds of structures. After all, master craftspeople may actually be inclined to build such things. They are pieces of art in addition to their pragmatic uses. Private mansions and yachts are in effect a kind of servitude to another predicated upon little more than the whim and wealth disparity within a moneyed society. Note that this is distinct from the labor that is utilized for the maintenance of public buildings, public spaces, etc., where such public-private distinctions are not predicated upon ownership as such, but rather upon the intended use. Personal goods, homes, etc., that require the continuous labor of others to maintain, utilize, etc., are in essence things we would expect not to exist in a moneyless society. It's worth noting distinctions between, say, boats, cars, and houses that may require the occasional labor of others with specialized skills, knowledge, etc., to maintain. So, for instance, plumbers, electricians, mechanics, etc., are all legitimate labor, whereas having your personal yacht captain and crew and various servants to run your mansion is illegitimate labor. The suggestion of this, I take to be fairly powerful response to the concern, is that the moneyless free labor society as such will in point of fact delineate well between these. Given the option, people will simply choose to not do such labor. What the hands of labor do in general is reduce the overall work hours required while maintaining or improving the quality of the products and services provided. Interestingly enough, insofar as some folks may nonetheless choose to do such kinds of servitude labors, such may actually be considered fine sorts of labors to do. That is, whereby such choices are not made via the force of moneyed concerns, but rather, say, as a matter of devotion towards another, or an organization, as a matter of prestige, etc. Such may be considered valid sorts of labor. Such may indeed, in some sense, underpin much in the way of larger-scalar organizational entities in general. That is, it is plausible to understand the desire to work in some organization as an underling, as a requirement for the organization to exist at all, with the understanding that the organization itself is worthwhile. Such is a bit more odd when given the specificity of a mansion or yacht, But it is at least plausibly the case that some persons may hold such presence that someone else determines to support them via exactly staffing their private mansion or yacht. Such is reminiscent of a couple of human practices, the rights of kings and queens, and the gendered division of labor in a home. Of these, the former is more akin to the issue than the latter. The latter is given greater attention elsewhere in this piece, briefly here noting merely that domestic labor is real labor, and not really a servitude institution. Minor mansions. This is likewise a rather relevant and worthwhile solution. Within the constraints of the bioregional resources, within a moneyless society, housing by and large will be improved. The notion therein requires some significant degree of explanation and is related to the hands of labor notion. Given the possibility of people to live within a house that is their own, they will tend to take better care of the house. Renters may be incentivized to not destroy a place, but a homeowner is incentivized to actually upgrade the house to within the limits of their own ability to maintain the structure without extraneous labor. Minor mansions, hobbies. As noted earlier, if people have the time, resources, and capacity of choice in the matter, they will tend to do things that improve the quality of their homes as a matter of course. One important lesson of the pandemic is exactly how the demand for all the materials, goods and services for home improvement shot through the roof. Given the time, resources, knowledge, skills, and available services, what people gonna do but of course improve the quality of their lives by improving their homes. Minor mansions, reduction of specialized labor. This is a bit of an odd response but worth noting. People who maintain their own houses, rather than renters and absentee landlords, learn the skills to maintain their own houses. This reduces the overall need for outsourced specialized labor, and hence reduces the overall work hours required in the Moneyless Free Labor Society. Similar can be said of cooking, childcare, and education. When given the option, or when the issue is forced, such as via the pandemic, people take on these kinds of specialized roles for themselves. Such generally reduces the overall work hours required in a society, and also improves the quality of lives that people are living, giving them meaningful work, like raising babies instead of sending them to factory child-rearing facilities, cooking good foods for their family and friends, and doing the basic upkeep and maintenance of the homes they live in. Note that this particular aspect, as well as others, isn't something that can occur without the advent of industrial processes. The capacity for folks to in the current buy worked materials is wildly different than it used to be. Making something from scratch, in other words, is not really a reduction in the overall labor within a society. However, the capacity for folks to now and within a moneyless society rather simply obtain such worked goods for their homes does entail a reduction in the overall work hours within a society. Over time, in other words, as quality long-term housing options are thereby constructed and maintained by those living within them as a matter of, say, pleasure of simply doing so, the requirement to have others do that sort of specialized labor diminishes. Minor mansions, building for quality. Consider the differences between producing housing that is high quality versus housing that is lower quality. Aside from sale value, there isn't actually a whole lot of differences involved. Wherein sale value entails the value of a wide variety of goods and services entailed in construction of a home. For sure there are meaningful differences regarding the relative scarcity of various materials, But the metrics of staying within the relevant bioregional renewal rates already accounts for these kinds of concerns. Likewise, the imperative to utilize local resources also restrains the usages of what would be rare resources within a given bioregion. In other words, what is common in a bioregion is primarily what is used. What is rare within a bioregion is what is generally not used. Such dovetails well with the technical workings of the open gift-giving market. An upshot is that by working within those constraints, all the incentives are to build higher quality housing. Utilizing a resource fewer times conserves the resource and requires less labor overall. Utilizing local resources primarily, but not exclusively, also entails less labor, and better managing to stay within the relevant renewal rates of resources. As with other sorts of aspects of the moneyless free labor society, from labor's perspective it is far better to build something high quality than something low quality, wherein quality is fundamentally about long-term durability. Durability has of itself a somewhat unobvious aspect of aesthetical concern. That is, something being made beautifully also thereby grants the something greater durability, at least as regards luxury goods and services. The point therein being that folks are more inclined to maintain beautiful things, whereas they are more inclined to want to shift ugly things towards the beautiful. This aspect ought not be overlooked, as somewhat silly as it may seem. Moreover, the laborer's incentives, beyond that of the concern for durability, is oft enough exactly the creation of the beautiful. The aesthetical worth of a place being of value as a matter of professional interest. Such may or may not overshadow the utility and long-term durability of a thing. Those kinds of questions are not super-relevant to this piece nor this point. Here the point is that building for quality entails at least these things, durability and aesthetical value. Hence the hands of labor will tend towards those kinds of things, and thus we ought expect an increase in the quality of goods and services, in other words, minor mansions, minor yachts, minor luxury goods. What is said of the home is valid for any luxury good we may refer to. Within a moneyless free labor society, these kinds of goods are incentivized to be produced by the very people doing the labor. By this I am referring rather specifically to the quality of the goods being produced, their relevant longevity, and their relevant stability within the local economy. In the current the constraints are money. This is important for the reader to keep in mind. After all, it isn't the case that there are no existing constraints within the current. Working within the constraints of the local bioregion primarily, and ecologies as a whole secondarily, entails some meaningful constraint on the goods and materials so produced. However, within that limit, the incentives for the production of all goods tends towards quality, longevity of the goods and materials so produced, and the preference towards the maintenance of said goods by the people that own them. In the current, such goods are produced with an aim of making money, hence sustainability of the practices involved are not really considered, and such things as planned obsolescence are a norm. Note that this particular concern will also be brought up elsewhere in this piece. Here its relevance has far more to do with the concerns regarding luxury goods, and what we may consider luxury as such. In this section the notion is rather bluntly that luxury goods are goods that are high quality, meaning aesthetically valuable and long-lasting. That such dovetails well with all the current concerns regarding the ecologies, and much of the concerns regarding inequalities in the distribution of goods is worth recognizing, but will be handled more directly in the relevant sections. Here the hands of labor prefer to do a good job once, rather than a poor job that requires them to work again and again. Worth comparing to the current system in which private labor has a rather perverse incentive to do a job just good enough to pass inspection so that they can come back and do the job again. After all, with the aim being money and work being the means to provide it, more work equals more money. Desires and wants, luxury as such. What, after all, is the value of gold, diamonds, jewels, and other such things in a moneyless society? Simply their aesthetic, and potentially their prestige in ownership. In terms of prestige, we may simply note that much of that prestige is negated within a moneyless society. There is, after all, exactly nothing of monetary value to these items. They signify exactly nothing in terms of the wealth of the person who has them. In terms of their aesthetic, we may note that there is something of value therein, as in, they may make life a bit better for the people that have them. In the same way that a good set of clothes that looks nice improves the quality of life of the people wearing and interacting with said peoples. Of the aesthetic, however, we can note that glass baubles largely do just as well. Costume jewelry for costume needs, wants and desires suffice just fine. Quality of craft involved in creating such things matters far more than rarity of the materials as such. We may perhaps hold that there is a free labor moneyless disposition to nonetheless produce these kinds of luxury goods. After all, it may be the case that people are in fact so inclined to work with those kinds of materials as a matter of art. However, I suspect that such is not generally the case, given the amount of labor involved in producing those kinds of goods, not on the craftsperson's side of things, but rather on the mining side of things. Hence folks can again get a sense of the likely output from a moneyless free labor society, namely that mining for wealth, as such simply isn't a thing. After all, there is no wealth to be had. Mining is a lot of hard labor, intensive, and ecologically destructive in almost all cases. Lacking the incentives of wealth, in the sense of money, as opposed to wealth in the sense of quality of life, goods and services, labor has a tendency to avoid pointless hard labor. Likewise, absent the signs and signifiers of wealth, such as brand names, much of the hubbub surrounding the moneyed society of luxury goods is likely to go away. Moreover, as noted earlier, the creation of quality crafts via hobbies, and incentives for craftspeople to produce high-quality durable goods and services is likely to increase. Where wealth is understood in terms of high quality, the moneyless society will have a tendency to produce more of that than a moneyed society which mistakes moneyed concerns for wealth. In other words, in terms of fashion, the other major sign of supposed wealth and luxury, within a moneyless society the relative rarity of such things as these tends towards extinction. Not in the sense of lacking in quality clothing, but rather in what quality clothing signifies. There is exactly no meaningful difference in terms of materials used as to what constitutes high fashion and lowbrow fashion. These kinds of distinctions are artifacts of a moneyed society in which such differentiations are important. The mass production of high-quality fashion goods, to be quite blunt about it, is not something that can't be done. It simply isn't done specifically for the purposes of distinguishing between wealth and non-wealth. Contrary to the depiction of peoples wearing drab things within a society that prizes equality, the capacity for the mass production of such goods within a moneyless society entails the capacity for a plethora of such goods as being freely available. As with other aspects within a moneyless society, it is important to note the relevant point of limits of material goods and labor, the emphasis upon production of high-quality, longer-lasting goods towards sustainability, which has the benefits of overall reduction of work hours. Similar can be said, for instance, of most technological goods. The differentiation between these in terms of capacity is largely not done as a matter of, say, actual costs associated with the production of such technological goods. Rather, some goods are deliberately produced as lower or higher degrees of quality simply as a matter of differentiation, predicated upon the plausible returns associated with the products. In short, higher quality technological goods are not meaningfully more expensive to produce, but by creating the disparity between the quality, the producers are able to thereby charge far more for the higher quality goods. In a moneyless free labor society, the incentives of the workers again is to produce those goods as few times as possible. Hence an emphasis on higher quality production, lower en masse output, etc. All of which is accomplished through the hands of labor approach. Such is not always going to be the case with technological goods, but in the current, when speaking of, say, computers, phones, TVs, etc., by and large this is in point of fact the case. Such scamming on products is the sort of thing one would expect within a moneyed society. It is a kind of foundational principle for such systemizations. An upshot within a moneyless free labor economy is that such distinctions again melt away, increasing rather than decreasing the overall quality of goods so produced. In other words, lacking a moneyed incentive, the producers are incentivized to produce quality, moreover, and perhaps more importantly, the incentive to arbitrarily distinguish between high and low quality goods simply goes away. The limit of such increase in quality is proportional to the degree whereby such distinctions are in fact predicated upon little more than the differentiations noted earlier. Hence, such will not be the case across the board. Some distinctions are real in terms of the materials needed, labor needed, etc. To continue with the relevant example of computers and phones, supercomputers and quantum computers are fairly definitively not merely distinctions of superfluousness regarding sales tactics and moneyed concerns. In the current, the brand name is another good example of this kind of phenomenon, whereby the branding of something is the quality to which the price is attached. Such sales tactics are superfluousness of the moneyed concerns. They do not actually speak of the quality of goods and services, beyond the qualifying remarks provided via a maker's mark. In other words, in a moneyed society, the usefulness of a maker's mark as a means of denoting who made something, and hence, that something may be of an expected sort or kind, including an expected sort or kind of quality, is perverted to the mereness of a symbol and sales tactic. The maker's mark becomes but a meaningless symbol attached to a good or service, the quality and oft indeed the maker of which are so far removed from the mark as to be void. Supreme as a brand was and is a joke. It is this perversion of the utility of a maker's mark to the perverted ends that moneyed societies can provide, towards the ends of merely symbolism making symbols. Full detachment from reality, nothing whatever to do with a real economy. Along the same lines, the notion of planned obsolescence in the current is a kind of practice that the hands of labor would generally stop. Planned obsolescence is the practice of making something with the deliberate intention of having it no longer be functionally useful after a certain period of time. Insofar as planned obsolescence is used as a methodology to make money, such practices are stopped out of hypothesis within a moneyless free labor society. Likewise, planned obsolescence as a methodology for producing more goods and services to be bought are generally stopped via the hands of labor. That is, new models that are produced specifically as a means to induce people to buy them and hence make obsolete older models. However, there are other rationales for planned obsolescence that may persist. For instance, if and when better methodologies that better fit the needs, wants and desires of people, or which better fit within the bioregional constraints and renewal rates are available, it is prudent to plan for the obsolescence of older methodologies. As with other aspects, the motivations for planned obsolescence shift, but the practice remains. In the instance of cars, trucks, etc., each of these have a life expectancy to them. That is, assuming proper maintenance, they are expected to continue functioning for a certain amount of time. Producing them with an aim of supplying for the needs, wants and desires of the relevant populations entails producing them within that limit of effective planned obsolescence. In other words, en masse production to meet the initial needs, wants and desires, followed by slower production to meet the replacement values as the initial batch becomes no longer functional. Another version of planned obsolescence that remains valid is expected improvements in technology. In at least some cases, an industry is able to have a good sense as to when a significant improvement in technology is going to occur. Planning to make obsolete the older technology is plausibly a good thing. Notable regarding planned obsolescence as it relates to improvements in technologies, when it comes to actual implementation of a new technology, there are fewer barriers in place to actualize it within a moneyless free labor society. Jobs that older technologies support have no particular incentive to fight against newer technologies, not having to work to live. Entails that if newer and better technology comes along, the adoption of it is less problematic. Likewise, the incentives to produce actually improved technologies, as opposed to gimmicks and such, are increased. Lacking a moneyed incentive to produce gimmicky, pointless improvements entails a significant drop in the production of such things. The hands of labor likewise have little incentive to produce such gimmicky things, as it just means more labor for them. A moneyless free labor society has embedded within it several metrics as to what may constitute actually improved technology. Labor-saving technologies, resource-saving technologies, technologies that provide better access to materials for hobbies, crafts, etc., technologies that improve health, sustainable food production technologies/techniques, and distributive technologies and techniques of the material goods and services. The imperative and consequent of the hands of labor to generally make do, likewise present a case of effective planned obsolescence. In short, making do with something has some limits associated with convenience, quality of life, and general well-being. At some point there are desires that amount to making improvements rather than simply making do. Such amounts to a kind of hands of labor approach of obsolescence that isn't exactly planned, so much as embedded within the system. Needs. A common fallacy within the classical formulations of anti-capitalistic dispositions is a reduction of the material goods of people to a minimum. The question of what are the actual needs after all is a critical question, and who determines that is likewise a critical part of the answering of that question. As already alluded to, A moneyless free labor society will tend towards the production of high-quality goods as a matter of course, due to their incentives to reduce the overall amount of hours they actually have to work. The moneyless free labor society has another kind of solution towards the avoidance of this issue, namely, folks in general are free to determine what labor they actually do. The presumption therein is that different folks will prefer different sorts of labor as a matter of course. There is no from-on-high dictum being postulated, beyond the first-pass data approximation regarding the work hours actually currently required to meet the needs, wants, and desires of people, and the bioregional constraints wherein the sustainability of the practices actually matter. The question for the laborer, after all, is far more, what kind of labor do I want to do, given the various options available to me? Such is already the basic methodology the species uses, especially within capitalistic free market economies. What is different within the moneyless version is merely the incentives and constraints placed upon the laborer. What may, however, be vital to the moneyless free labor society is to ensure that certain essential labor kinds of jobs are fulfilled. Here we have a very good snapshot of what constitutes essential labor via the pandemic. It isn't a perfect view, but it does provide a very good sense of what that term essential really entails. Some aspects of the essential labor will differ meaningfully within the moneyless society, as some currently essential jobs simply would no longer exist, and out of hypothesis the primary aim is bioregional self-sufficiency insofar as such is possible. Hence, transportation of goods, while still essential, will likely see a vast reduction in the overall work hours, resources used, etc., to accomplish the relevant tasks. Needs, as the pandemic illustrated to us, have firstly to do with basic household activities, rather than broad community activities. Having enough food, shelter, and time available to do family activities are essentials and constitute needs. But I want to stress that the moneyless free labor society doesn't entail anything like a reduction to the needs only of a society. It focuses on the plausibility of a flourishing society to include its wants and desires. The discussion of needs is perhaps best understood as being a meaningful, structurally sound footing regarding free labor. In other words, these essential jobs ought to be prioritized in their consideration by the free labor. Such needn't be forced upon the free labor, far more simply noting that they are high-priority jobs. This point is expanded upon later in this piece. Here we are noting the delineation between needs and wants and desires, and how those gross categories of differentiation may play out. Luxury goods and services, the wants and desires of a people, being broadly understood in this section as the higher quality goods, the in general motivation to produce minor luxury goods and to provide minor luxury services. The needs being broadly understood experimentally so via the pandemic. In either case, either in the case of wants and desires, or in the case of needs, the species has a proven track record of being capable of providing those things without recourse to money, and a moneyless free labor society here is arguing in theory has the capacity to provide the proper motivational forces for folks on a socio-cultural level to construct and maintain such productive capacities in a sustainable manner and at scalar relevance. Such addresses some of the most common kinds of concerns folks express when discussing these sorts of issues as they relate to luxury goods and services. The concerns of greed and overconsumption are fairly real ones in terms of any societal system of creation and distribution of goods. The tendency towards accumulation of pointless goods, hoarding, are plausible concerns, but I tend to think these are overblown in a moneyless society. As the first pass through the theory noted, the species already has fairly good information regarding what the fulfillment of actual needs, wants and desires will look like. In the rich world at any rate, we have a sense of what is required to fairly broadly fulfill the needs, wants and desires of large populations wherein barely restrained greed is the actual norm. Much has been written on the issues of greed in the modern industrialized and rich world. I will merely note what I take to be the most pertinent point. If we were to provide that particular standard of living throughout the world, the resources available on the planet simply cannot sustain such living. In other words, the current system is unsustainable, deeply in need of revision, and hence appeals to it as an ideal are simply wrong. Within the moneyless system, part of the aim is to reformulate the system from predication on rather pointless greed, towards one that is predicated upon the realities of all economies, namely, labor, the relevant bioregional constraints and the renewal rates of the resources therein. Labor concerns present a meaningful check upon the impulse of greed. To produce the kinds of goods, after all, requires more labor, and there has to be people willing and able to produce those goods. The incentive of the laborer is to work less, not more, at least within the realm of the production of en masse goods. If labor finds the value of the goods produced to be wanting, then they simply do not bother to do the work. Of course, the laborer is wise enough to understand that laboring is required to produce the goods and services they use. Hence the hands of labor's balancing between producing and consuming the goods and services. Consider this from the perspective of the entrepreneur. They have some kind of idea in mind for a product. What they need to do is convince the laborers within the community that it is worthwhile to spend time producing the product, or simply to produce the products themselves utilizing their own labor. In other words, they have to convince the actual workers that such is going to produce some good for the society. This is distinctly different from the current moneyed model, wherein the metric of concern is simply if it can possibly make money. Doesn't matter one whit if the product so produced is good for the community or good for anyone at all. The product could be actively harmful. What is important is if they can, in effect, con people into buying their product. Little doubt that such isn't the reality for all such products so produced. Some non-insignificant number of products produced within moneyed societies do actually provide for the better of people, increasing their quality of life. The point is that the moneyed society doesn't stop with that. Their incentives are not after all the good of the society, but rather the accumulation of wealth. Perhaps more to the point, as is oft the case, in the current the entrepreneur already has to convince someone that there is a plausibility that the good or service they are going to be providing is something that people will actually want. Namely, generally speaking, they have to approach people with money to beg for their money in order to start a business. Without getting overly critical of the current system, within a moneyless society that kind of begging still occurs. It is just oriented towards different people. Specifically in the case of wanting to utilize someone else's labor, the beggar therein is seeking the approval of other laborers to do the labor in question. Such may also be noted as something that generally already occurs within the current system. Startups oft utilize exactly this kind of dynamic. Convincing a small group of people to put their time and energy into something, because they believe that in the long run they'll make money off of it. All that really changes is the metric of concern. They are not necessarily concerned about making money, but rather about the excitement of the proposition as something they can do to fulfill their basic labor requirements for the society in general. Perhaps too, such things as, wow, I think that might really be helpful for my community or some other community, etc. In other words, work that sounds useful, meaningful, practical, enjoyable, etc., or just work that needs to be done. Folks know they need to do something, perhaps they don't particularly even care that much as to exactly what it is. They just recognize cause they are adults that they ought to contribute to society and they don't need master's whip, or the subtle machinations of money to actually inform them of that. As with other aspects from a labor perspective, these are already things folks do. For most people, they simply look at the options available to them and make some decision on the matter, oft with the understanding that it isn't particularly amazing work, but that they need some kind of job. The point, as always with that particular sort of reply to potential concerns of a moneyless free labor society, is to note that people already do that sort of thing, and hence there isn't a real concern there worth noting. For sure, it may be the case that labor reevaluates exactly which kinds of jobs they actually want to support, and that may change some aspects overall as to what kinds or how much of various goods and services are available, but it isn't going to be the case that people won't choose some degree of the available jobs on the offer. After all, we know people generally need, want, and desire a lot of these goods and services. There is also a relevant case to be made that if laborers decide not to do that sort of labor, then it is exactly the kinds of labor, goods, or services that no one actually needs, wants, or desires to do. Definition of surplus labor. Such rather uncontroversially is applicable for scams, thievery, selling poor quality goods and services, and so forth. More controversially, such may be applicable to other kinds of goods and services that are not, shall we say, obviously terrible things, but which it turns out people in general just don't really want. As with other aspects, such is in theory how the current moneyed capitalistic system works. In practice, however, such doesn't function well for a variety of reasons within the moneyed capitalist system. Among them, the requirement to work to live entailing that people fight to provide unwanted services, that people are susceptible to mass manipulation, high-pressure sales tactics, etc., and that companies, businesses, etc., actively seek to develop effective monopolies that provide no other alternatives, thereby eliminating the possibility that they can go out of business, or indeed, the imperative to continuing doing a business that no one needs, wants, or desires, simply because it provides money, jobs, and so forth. The Moneyless Free Labor Society simply eliminates these kinds of motivations and issues, and hence insofar as current businesses are utilizing these sorts of tactics, they will tend to fail. Such is not something to be lamented, it is a massive market correction that has been long in the making. If, after all, it turns out that few are the people that actually appreciate fast food places, that their success in the current is due to distortions of the labor workforce via the metrics of money, that few are those who would want to work there, and fewer still those who actually prefer that kind of food, then there is no cause to lament the loss of the fast food places. As within a capitalistic moneyed modeling, we simply hold that such is what labor and consumers actually want. They are better at determining their needs, wants, and desires themselves, and hence so much the better that those kinds of unwanted labors and services are no longer provided. It is difficult to see how the current moneyed capitalistic defender can justify any lamentation of such losses of existing businesses, given that any rationale they utilize is ultimately dependent upon the same reasoning. The only difference being proposed, again, is in the metrics we are utilizing, moneyed metrics or hands of labor metrics. As such relates to this subsection, we may call these kinds of loss of existing businesses as the elimination of greed-based businesses, understood as businesses whose only real support is greed via moneyed concerns. Likewise, the bioregional constraints already provide for the delimiting of greed. When the local bioregionally bound economy is geared towards primarily providing for the well-being of the people actually living there, the use of the resources therein already dictate the limits whereby greed can be a meaningful problem. Greed becomes a far more dangerous issue wherein the greedy are utilizing resources that do not have any immediate effect upon them beyond increasing their wealth, as in positive effects on their personal lives, with all negative effects being externalized to others. When labor is granted the dictum of say as to what is produced, not in the sense of control of the means of production as such, but rather as a matter of not being forced to work beyond that which is required to meet the needs, wants and desires of the relevant local economy, the tendency will be to weed out all the BS labor involved in producing wealth. As noted earlier, for the cottage industry the only real motivations to produce more are a matter of kindness, generosity, boredom, recognition of their efforts, something to do, and helping to meet broader well-understood needs, wants and desires, wherein the production of these goods and services is so much easier than it used to be that the ask to do so is not nearly as much of a concern. The point being that the fairly mindless generation of goods and services with an aim towards the generation of wealth are not of any real concern. Hence labor will tend to not do such things. Insofar as something like greed may persist within the system, it amounts far more to people choosing to produce more because it benefits the relevant bioregions. It says something rather disconcerting that kind of transformation of greed from a vice to a virtue simply through the removal of money is plausible. The greedy within a community want to produce more for the community simply because it helps out the community in that they thereby all are able to freely partake in those goods and services. We may perhaps understand such folks as not being greedy, but rather as being industrious. Industriousness sans greed is not an obvious bad thing, though it can potentially become an issue, there being potentials for overproduction. However, the hands of labor provides for a significant check on that, as do, again, the bioregional constraints. In simple terms of someone's overtaking within a moneyless society wherein we are understanding such as, say, going to the food market and taking far more than one really needs, or even wants or desires is a less abstracted consideration, wherein more than they want or desire is understood as being wasteful. As in, they end up just throwing away the food, not using the goods or services, etc. This kind of concern of greed is one that is predicated upon a supposed scarcity of goods. Consider this from the point of view of the consumer. When there is a known scarcity or potential scarcity involved, they are incentivized to be cautious. That sense of caution entails that they hoard, they stock up on things they think they will need, want, or desire. Again, relevant to the point are lessons of panic buying during the pandemic. There was more than enough to go around for everyone, but due simply to panic, people acted on a fear of scarcity to garner as much as they could for themselves. Such dispositions are at least in part, and perhaps in great part, the issue with greed. There may be a period of adjustment involved for people within a moneyless society, but as the abundance that is actually available becomes clear to people, that disposition will lessen. Likewise, with the free availability of all goods and services wherein people are uncertain if they have enough money coming in to provide those kinds of things, again, the disposition to grab as much as one can lessens greatly. Lacking the fear of going hungry, the concern of if they will have a job, the concerns about working to live, not surprisingly people's disposition changes to something far less greedy. If they aren't thrown into some kind of competition to live, in other words, their disposition to fight for it largely goes away. Making room for such things as kindness, modesty in what they need, want and desire, basic generosity towards others, etc. Not to mention the plausible health benefits of reducing the level of stress in their lives. Perhaps more directly and to the point on the issue, we may posit that the consumer is in the better position to understand what their needs, wants, and desires are. With the preceding paragraphs in mind, absent those kinds of concerns, the consumer can better determine what kinds of goods and services they need, want, and desire, rather than, in effect, being told what they need, want, and desire by the suppliers, who do the telling for the simple reason that they make more money by selling more goods. Hence again, we get a sense of how the moneyed concerns distort the labor workforce's concern, and how they distort the consumer's concerns. Why overconsume? After all, as the consumers may well say, we are being told over and over again to overconsume. What does anyone really expect in that situation? When moneyed concerns are put in place as if limits, there is a dual incentive that distorts the production and consumption of goods and services. On the one hand, the producer of goods and services is incentivized to sell as much as possible, regardless of the consequences, to push, peddle, and cajole as many people as they can to consume more. On the other hand, the consumer is incentivized to consume within their means, or more than their means, whereby their means is a determination of money rather than even their base appetites, let alone their means of concerns about the community. In other words, money, as if it were limit, isn't tied to anything, and hence the consumer can consume without reference to other, more reasonable limits. Greed, in sum, becomes the limit. Here again the moneyed capitalistic defender is going to have a difficult time responding, given that the moneyed capitalistic defender's position is fundamentally to let the individuals decide such things themselves, and that the individuals, families, etc., are in a better position to make those kinds of determinations themselves. Granting there may be a period of adjustment, there is very little reason beyond irrational fears of other people and suppositions of scarcity to believe, let alone argue, that an individual or people en masse would overconsume in this sort of manner sans the incentives to do so. How childish we would have to be to believe such things, after all. Likewise, there is a tendency for people to accumulate things. This is a kind of byproduct from the current system, the consumer culture. Much of what has been noted regarding luxury goods is applicable here, namely, absent the incentives of greed. To what extent is greed thereby ameliorated if not outright eliminated? If one knows that they can freely partake in the goods and services of society, if the illusory value of those goods and services are dispelled, the monetary value of them is removed, does one really even care any more about obtaining them? More than just this aspect of the consumer is the highly likely far greater aspect of the seller, The selling of goods and services that are simply not required, wanted, or desired. The manufacturing of needs, wants, and desires is a thing. Such again is a byproduct of the current system wherein people are forced to work for life, being forced to work for money and hence forced to do something, anything at all, even the most horrific of things, in order to make money, in order to live. Such speaks towards the thieves, the corporate pirates, the sellers of shitty goods and services, the scammers, the hucksters, hustle culture, and so on. Absent the motivation to sell goods or provide services simply in order to live, such practices ought to radically decrease. Indeed, I have a difficult time imagining why they wouldn't radically decrease, to be perfectly honest about it. Absent all the shitty, subpar, irrelevant, and worse than worthless goods and services being offered, overconsumption radically decreases. A bit more than this, when it comes to fads and supposed rare value of things in general, such as, for instance, limited editions, collectibles, and so forth, it isn't that these things don't exist at all, but the incentives to make or acquire them radically diminishes. We may wonder, if someone wants them, how do they get them? But then, what that boils down to are assumptions of want largely predicated upon pretending they have a monetary value, versus assumptions of values of want predicated upon real needs, wants, and desires. That is, what are the needs, wants, and desires of individuals and people in general sans any monetary valuation whatsoever? The iterative creation of ever new models. This is also covered in other sections in this piece, but as it relates to greed specifically, the interrelated process whereby businesses are forced to create yearly models of products and forced also to sell these to people, is a massive cause of overconsumption and overproduction. Again, rather than wonder at the individual consumer as to why it is that they might overconsume, bother to take seriously the various business practices that are in place within the current system and note the super fucking obviousness of the problems therein. Lacking any particular incentives to produce new models every year, the tendency to produce higher quality, longer-lasting models prevails, and hence the disposition to pointlessly produce new models dissipates. Basic power of education. If one knows as a matter of course that overconsumption is harmful, does one thereby reduce the degree of consumption? Harmful in the sense that the more one consumes, the more one needs to work? Such is suggestive of the hands of labor as a mechanism of containment on the problems of greed. Consider rather directly the realities and power of basic education. If we bother to educate people to not overconsume, we might reasonably suppose that they won't. I don't think such is a particularly wild concept. There are further aspects therein seriously worth noting. Aside from the practice of hoarding, there are no real incentives to overconsumption. Overeating, to be blunt, is a problem for the person doing the overeating. Having a larger home entails more cleaning. Having more clothes entails more time spent cleaning the clothes. Having more material goods in general entails more labor to produce and maintain them. Note that these kinds of limits go out the window in a moneyed society. After all, if one can always just pick up a whip or, a dollar bill, y'all, and get someone else to do it for you, there is no inherent limit to the number of material goods one can have. Just a monetary limit. Beyond the first pass-through of the moneyless system, as such is iteratively done, all the incentives of the system lend themselves towards the elimination of superfluous work hours, and a kind of ethic of satiation. Workload free time limit. Generally speaking, people who are spending time laboring at the production of goods and services are not spending time consuming them. This provides another aspect of the hands of labor that puts a very meaningful check upon the capacity of consumption. Ultimately, there will be some sort of balance between these. One can only consume as much as one labors, and one can't really consume while one labors. What exactly that limit is in the Moneyless Free Labor Society is actually an unknown value. Via the existing system, and this will be expanded on a bit more later, we can strongly suspect that a conservative guess as to what that limit may be is about 40 hours a week per household, wherein household is generally understood as 2 people of working age. The reasonableness of this, of course, is that such is already the nominal limit within the workforce per person, but if we just wind the clock back a bit to before women entered the workforce en masse, such was the actual nominal limit per household. To fend off the weirdos, I'll add that such does not imply that women shouldn't be in the workforce. Such merely entails what a conservative estimate as to the nominal balancing of the current work/consumption ratio may be. I'll also add that it is almost certainly the case that this is a very conservative estimate, as efficiencies in the production of goods has wildly increased. The superfluousness of labor existing in the market is likely extremely high, and the restructuring of the economy towards a moneyless free labor society very likely entails reducing the number of work hours overall, especially over time and iteration, and especially as it relates to labors outside the home. Related to concerns of overconsumption, luxury goods and services, and who makes the decision, the question of who gets to do the thing and who gets to have the thing. In a moneyed society, the notion is something like, if you want to do the thing, you pay for it. This controls who gets to do the thing or have the thing. There are, after all, only so many things available at any given time. Partly this is addressed via the hands of labor. That mechanism effectively controls the availability of things to do or have towards the maximal capacity of a bioregion to provide said things to do and have. However, I think the concern is a bit more motivated by something like the following. Suppose there is an event that is popular. Everyone wants to go to it. How do we determine who goes? First come, first serve is a fairly fine solution. Folks ought to know from experience at this point that that is in all pragmatics already how the system works. It just has this superfluous element called money attached to it. What I mean by that is that for popular events, activities, and products, there is already a demand for them, even with the metric of money, such that not everyone who wants to go can go, not everyone who wants the thing can have the thing. All money is doing is delimiting the number of participants, rather arbitrarily and with massive inequalities as it stands. The point therein being that there is nothing in this concern as such. It isn't as if we are currently not dealing with that same issue. What the Moneyless Free Labor Society does on the one hand is open that particular rat's race to everyone, and on the other hand offer as a meaningful balancing of such things via bioregional constraints, imperative to stay within the renewal rates of the resources and the hands of labor. Of the latter, the hands, some bit more can be said of it. With the removal of all the superfluous labor in the current systems, people have the capacity to focus more on their hobbies, joys, and putting on such things as special events. The point therein being that the moneyless free labor system better provides for those kinds of things that the species enjoys. Granted, such occurs within the limits of the bioregion's various capacities to do so, But among those key components is exactly the labor involved, and not necessarily the resources used. In other words, the capacity for people to attend such things is currently dependent upon money, and likewise the capacity for people to provide such things is currently predicated upon money. Those kinds of events are super expensive in terms of money, but they are actually fairly cheap in terms of resources. Paying for the venue, materials and labor needed to put on such things is of far greater concern for those who put them together than paying for any actual resources consumed. In other words, the materials involved are generally used again and again, the resource cost being very low. The venue likewise doesn't really have any resource costs associated with it once it's built, beyond maintenance and energy use. It has labor costs, but not resource costs associated with it. As it concerns bioregional constraints, these are embedded within the system as is, and while there may be changes thereof, specifically, a tendency towards more locals going to local shows, the bioregional constraint entails that mostly people within a given locale will attend a given event within said locale. This due to all the super obvious things, and not really stemming from any law, rule, or dictum. An important upshot regarding this concern being that the kinds of events that we all enjoy are by far more available to everyone within a moneyless free labor society, without any huge uptick in the material costs of doing so. In terms of the popular products, much of this, as noted earlier in luxury goods, is a lot of hubbub about nothing. It is, in other words, the production and selling of pointless products in an effort to make money that causes these kinds of mad dashes to the store to get the latest and greatest thingy thing. Hence, the issue the moneyed people may be pointing to is very likely far more an issue that has to do with a moneyed society as such, rather than an issue to do with supply and demand. Much of that is handled via the hands of labor mechanism. Labor doesn't want to produce pointless things to sell just to make money, that just means more labor they have to do. Labor does, however, want to produce high-quality durable goods and services, as those are exactly the kinds of things they themselves are getting for their labor. Such touches upon a point that deserves some significant analysis and consideration. If, after all, someone somewhere has some such baubles of a thing that is rare and they don't want it anymore, they can simply give it away, trade it privately with other people, barter as opposed to selling, and so forth. There isn't any reason why that cannot happen, as is oft the case. The motivations for doing so are simply different. Somewhat tangentially but relevant still, in terms of museum-quality pieces, we may suppose that by and large those kinds of things belong in museums. Similarly, for such ancient things as are commonly in the current referred to as World Heritage Sites, ancient ruins, etc. Such isn't the same as an old coin, or a rare plushie, or rare baseball card, comic book, etc. Nor would I particularly hold that privately held museum-quality pieces ought necessarily be seized. See, however, notes on the limitations of luxury goods, namely, mansions requiring servants and so forth that are not publicly held places are likely fairly difficult to maintain. Does such bartering of rare things open the door to what a moneyless free labor society wanted to avoid? The effective valuation of goods and services in abstraction? Suppose there is a rare object that many people desire for whatever silly reason, 'cause let's be clear, it would be a silly reason. They place it on an open market, eBay or whatever. They aren't looking to sell it for money, 'cause like, what's that shit? but they are looking to trade it for other sorts of things. A skilled barterer can do this sort of thing to acquire a great deal of other things that they may need, want, or desire. I don't see any reason why they couldn't do so, that is, such actions wouldn't necessarily be illegal. However, it does begin to beg the question as to why someone who produced, say, food, couldn't do the same sort of thing. How, in other words, do we delineate between these kinds of transactions? Why is the rare bauble transaction a thing, yet the food producer not? The former may barter for various things, the latter may not. There are at least a few responses to be made to this. It was already free. In the initial state, all goods and services are free. The general disposition of anyone within the system already generally has all that they need, want, or desire. This is a somewhat unsatisfactory response, in that it avoids the concern. But it does undercut the motivation of the concern as such, highlighting exactly how silly these kinds of rarities may really be. So it is worth keeping in mind. After all, the supposed barterer under scrutiny here already has access to the various goods and services themselves. That is, to what exactly they may be bartering for would be of something, perhaps as equally silly or equally rare, etc. In short, something someone else, for whatever reason, also is not transacting on the open gift-giving market. Gift-giving is the method. The general open gift-giving market is the norm. There isn't any prohibition against such trading of goods and services, such bartering that is. But it is simply agreed upon from the get-go that the needs, wants and desires are already met utilizing the existing data within the current system. In other words, the gift-giving methodology is the bartering methodology. This is a more satisfying answer, but still kinda dodges the concern a bit. The open gift-giving market, after all, provides for people to give and receive exactly these rarities. There isn't exactly a sense of bartering involved, at least not in the sense of exchanging directly this for that. Rather, there is a sense of bartering in that one receives freely what is offered, and gives freely what one has to offer. Such may amount to a kind of temporal difference, delayed gratification. In other words, the barterer wants to trade directly, immediately, this for that, whereas the open gift-giving market doesn't necessarily supply the exchange immediately, or rather, it doesn't directly immediately supply the exchange. The exchange happens, it just isn't directly happening. We might derisively say that this amounts to childish concerns about the impermanence of objects. I didn't see it happen immediately, therefore, it didn't happen. Suppositions of a hard-nosed barterer. Supposing that someone doesn't merely gift-give it, but rather exchanges it in some private transaction, pretty bauble for pretty bauble or whatever. Supposed rare item for some other item. In effect, convincing someone that something is of great value when it really isn't. Such is the principal origin of the abstraction of money, the pretense of supposed value. The question, though, is that those sort of things happen, that is, some people will desire to have some specific thing, and will hence seek it out, barter for it, etc. Is it illegal to do so? Does it undermine the systemization if they do so? Why they can, but not the farmer for their goods, or the barber for their services? Suppose the gift-giving exchange has multiple people that want some bauble of a thing. How does one determine who gets it? In the current online transactions that take place, it is basically first come, first serve. There are no restrictions involved. There isn't any obvious reason to change that. Suppose though that someone knows they have something valuable and wants to exchange it for something else in particular. Here's bauble A asking for bauble B. Suppose worse still, they know what they have isn't really valuable, it's just a bauble after all, but it is presented as if it were of great value. Such is after all the origins of money, supposed value of things, and so forth. The pretending that pretty seashells have value, or that paper has value, or that gold has value, each beyond whatever their basic utility may be. To reiterate the concern, suppose that such is allowed, that basic bartering of that sort is allowed. Why is that kind of bartering allowed, whereas bartering for crops grown, housing materials, etc., not? A plausible answer is exactly because it literally has no real value, no real utility as such. Because it is merely make-believe, playtime, fooling around. It is no more real than the kind of bartering that goes on in video games or in role-playing games, wherein the trading of goods and services are in-game with no value to them beyond the in-game practices of doing so. They are, in essence, different economies. The former wherein we are determining the needs, wants and desires of peoples as pertains to their material concerns, the latter wherein we are playing pretend, having fun, not really doing anything at all. One may as well be asking, why do children fight over toys? Or, how seriously do we want to take play fighting? And to the crop growers, the material goods suppliers, I may respond by asking, do they really want to trade their crops, goods and services for some pretty seashells? 'Cause after all, they already have access to all the goods and services available. So what else is it that they are trying to barter for? If the answer is pretty seashells again, different kinds of economies. One makes belief, the other reality, inasmuch as we may distinguish such things. Partly some of this concern may amount to conflating certain kinds of labor as being all that some people do. In other words, when we hold the concern of the farmer, we are pretending a few things. 1. That farming is all they do. That all their labor is caught up in farming, in other words. The farmer, like any other laborer in the Moneyless Free Labor Society, is granted a lot more free time to produce such things as baubles, and so forth. 2. We are also pretending that no one actually wants baubles. That kind of differentiation on the value of things pretends that there is a value beyond that which people themselves want. It attempts to tear into the distinctions between needs, wants and desires, giving a supposed priority to the needs, and discounting the wants and desires of people. Suppose we hold that some bauble is particularly cool, rare, etc., and suppose we cut that off via education to the contrary? Suppose further that the superabundance of goods and services already entails that people are not so inclined as such? Suppose that the education towards gift-giving undercuts the practice itself? Suppose all those things, and yet there are still people who prefer to collect some things. Boredom, something to do. Suppose, after all, someone has gathered together a bunch of trinkets, baubles, and so forth, perhaps handcrafted goods, perhaps not, but howsoever they acquired them, they're specifically interested in trading them for some other very specific goods or services that they cannot find on the regular open gift-giving market. Such entails, however, that among the more significant concerns as to why not to have a moneyless free labor society are no longer valid, that the question as to why would this person be able to do this, and not the crop grower as such, is already satisfied. Specifically, such amounts to tertiary concerns within the system. The relative unavailability of the supposed items, in other words, entails that they are not of the sort that are met via the primary methodologies of trading. Hence, they are valid sorts of trades within the tertiary interbioregional trading. Suppose someone trades in a private transaction, but of course all trades within the Moneyless Free Labor Society are already private transactions. Indeed, in the currents wherein all such trades are privately determined, this piece is merely removing money from such transactions, and strongly arguing for a change in priorities and constraints, but ultimately such amounts to a continuation of private transactions between differing bioregions, industries, goods, and services. In the longer term, such trades become more normalized, as they already generally have, and are essentially performative in the sense that all the relevant metrics involved are either outright known by the relevant industries, or else quantifiable, predictable, etc. Recall, the notion is to simply systematize that without reference to money as such. To systematize, in other words, predicated upon the fairly well understood needs, wants and desires, rather than money. But on the individual level, such is not really systematized. So and so does some craft work, creates some goods, and trades them on an individual level with some other individual. Perhaps, to be fairly blunt, outside the bounds of the open gift-giving market. As to why, we may admit the rationale for doing so is not particularly obvious, and that generally speaking the rationale is going to tend to be idiosyncratic, perhaps even silly, given that their needs, wants and desires are already met. As mentioned, such amounts to the kinds of transactions one may do in video games or role-playing games, in-game transactions, wherein the concern is that such in-game transactions are either not allowed, frowned upon, superfluous, or potentially damaging to the overall system. Suppose, after all, that after the Moneyless Free Labor Society is established, it turns out that some folks effectively create a currency of some kind. Digital currency, video game currency, etc., which people treat as so valuable that they begin trading other things for it. Clearly this is something that happens in the current, but the point of the concern is something like, is that illegal? Immoral? Will such ultimately undermine the Moneyless Free Labor Society by effectively recreating money in one form or another? Perhaps in a plethora of forms? Suppose someone bilks someone else out of something of more obvious material value, their car, in exchange for a supposed rare piece of digital currency, or digital art, or an original piece of non-digital art. Or some traditionally high-valued thing, like jewelry, gold, pretty seashells, etc. Suppose it isn't a bilking in the sense that all parties actually walk away happy, each believing they have something of value. Not positive its relevance, nor for that matter its validity, but I am reminded of the story of the settlers in America trading various goods to the Native Americans for ownership of the land, wherein the latter didn't have a real concept of what ownership of the land actually entailed, or that they didn't really consider it even possible to own the land. Perhaps we may understand the concern of bilking someone is exactly of the kind thereby described, the make-believe fantasy land that is constructed via notions of ownership of the land and the valuation of monies as such, whereby vast, invisible borders are constructed that have exactly no reality to them beyond the reality folks grant them via their imaginative musings. Perhaps we could hold such as a kind of problem, a sort of issue the species tends to face, and the kind of issue that the Barterer here, the question of the barter, is attempting to elucidate and poke at. If the concern is in regards to bilking someone, the notion is that such motivations to do so are limited within the Moneyless Free Labor Society, and that ultimately certain kinds of trading are in fact illegal and always have been. However, I think the concern runs a bit deeper than that. Is money as such, that is, perceived value as such, endemic to the species? I want to suggest that such kinds of trading predicated upon perceived values of goods and services is not in and of itself a bad thing. The broad position of the Moneyless Free Labor Society has far more to do with constraints, motivations, limitations, and modality of such trading. For instance, literal, in-game trading isn't itself a bad sort of thing, as in the make-believe games, video games, board games, and role-playing games that make use of in-game trading as a mechanism for creating exactly make-believe scarcity, rarity, etc. are all plausible, not bads, perhaps even good sorts of fun things for folks to partake in. The motivation there is pretty radically different than the motivation associated with the illusory and just as fantasy-oriented concerns of money, in that the latter attempts to create the reality as if it were a game, whereas the former simply acknowledges the fun associated with playing games when not taken too seriously. The barterer, in other words, as a game player, has exactly the role in regards to in-game kinds of things. Still, I think there is more here to the concern being expressed, namely that it is exactly insofar as the barterer is speaking of not merely in-game interactions whereby the concern comes to the fore. Another plausible reply is to note that the farmer, the industrialist, the laborers therein inclusively understood to those running the various organizations are of course already trading. What they are trading for exactly is free access to all the other goods and services within the society. Such concerns may touch upon the issues of labor resentment, suppositions that in-home labor is somehow less valuable than out-of-home labor, etc., which is already dealt with in other sections. Here, noting more simply that single focuside, the making and raising of babies is relevant labor for all families, and that the maintaining of a home is likewise relevant labor for all families. Perhaps the concern is a bit more related to this: the individual making their little crafts, is such legitimate labor? To which the answer is plausibly yes, understanding that such is tempered via the hands of labor. Supposing a lot of people are doing these little crafts as their relevant labor, the overall goods and services within a community are thereby being provided for via exactly that kind of labor. However, that kind of labor can be far more laborious than certain industrial processes. Hence the hands of labor will tend towards utilizing such tools to lighten the overall labor within the community. Regardless of what exact material or good we are speaking of, the demand for such things is real. Insofar as individuals are providing for those demands themselves, the need for the industrial processes to do so is lessened, or in some sense is redirected towards more raw and less worked materials. Barterer as cheat. Is the barterer skimming off the top? The barterer isn't really doing any particular labor beyond bartering. Perhaps they made the initial thing, perhaps they didn't. The point though is that beyond the open gift-giving market, the barterer, if they are skilled, can continuously barter for various things. Does that actually constitute real labor or not? I'm inclined to think not on an individual level, but they are on a scalarly larger level. In other words, bartering on an individual level is about acquiring one's own personal or familial needs, wants and desires, whereas bartering on a larger scalar is about acquiring the needs, wants and desires of people more generally. It is what the farmers and the industrialists do, the traders, and so forth on a broader scale, wherein such is valuable. Such is given some significant detailing in other sections. The individual could barter, there isn't any obvious harm, though there may be some unobvious harms in them doing so. But does such bartering constitute fulfilling of the labor requirements of an individual? That seems fairly dubious. Consider again the craftsperson, farmer, etc. They barter as a matter of course, but then they are producing something via their, and others, labor, and their aim is not really to garner various goodies for themselves, but rather to distribute those goods to others who can refine them, or indeed, merely offer the service of distributing them as such. They do so for the same reason that the laborers refining the goods so distributed do so, free access to all the goods and services available. Their trade in a sense is maximized, rather than trading for, in effect, trade tokens, or bartering for some particular good or service. They are trading as a matter of their occupation because the goods and services do need to be distributed in order for they themselves, and everyone else, to actually partake in all the various goods and services a society can produce. Hence, such producers may look upon the person bartering to acquire specific things as something of a fool. Yet of course such bartering fools may still do so, and there is at least this sense in which what they are doing is valuable labor. They are distributing goods and services that otherwise wouldn't be so distributed. In this sense we are perhaps getting at one aspect of the hands of labor, the propensity to trade individually between people. Each such trade reduces the amount of goods and services otherwise required to be produced. The barterer in particular may be moving goods and services already within the system en masse on an individual level, through the metrics of motivation to acquire various goods and services for themselves and their family. Sans the moneyed motivation in particular, wherein the barterer is effectively restricted to whatever the existing inventory is at any given moment. Such bartering has the effect of reusing goods and services that would otherwise be thrown away. The natural limit of this kind of labor being proportional to the amount of goods and services being otherwise produced. Hence, in a meaningful sense, the actions of bartering may serve as a check on the overproduction of goods and services. Here though we are speaking of such bartering beyond the open gift-giving market, which still strikes me as a bit odd. It is the case that participating within the open gift-giving market does constitute meaningful labor. Within a moneyless free labor society, what the barterer may do is potentially more efficiently move that market. Although I think there is something more to the notion than this, it is worth explaining a bit. The more people participating on an individual level with the open gift-giving market, the less waste there is in the society. Be that gift-giving or bartering for specific needs, wants, and desires. Noting that here we are referring rather specifically to various goods and services that people are not themselves necessarily producing, but which they nonetheless have. Such bartering eliminates the need to produce those kinds of goods and services again. What I think is remaining of the barterer is the question of the supposed relative value of rare goods and services. The honest barterer. Suppose honest motives, honest presentation. After all, there is little need to lie, deceive, etc. within the moneyless free labor society. The barterer does indeed have something that is rare, and hence in virtue of its rarity is potentially valuable, In the sense that if multiple people want it, it isn't the case that the barterer can necessarily simply make more of it. Perhaps they can, perhaps they can't, but the point is that there is some kind of legitimate limited amount of the thing. Understanding that such has a correlation to the notion of unequal distribution of especially slow-renewing resources, but is not necessarily the same kind of problem. In the latter there are actually generally a lot of those resources, whereas here we are speaking of goods and services that are actually quite rare, relatively unique, etc. Old comic books, for example, old coins, generally old things whereby their numbers tend to diminish over time, or rare services wherein relatively few people can actually produce said services, and such services are not easily distributable to people en masse. We may also be speaking of artificially induced scarcities of a given resource, literally and figuratively, in-game resources. Let's deal with each of these kinds individually. Non-purposefully produced rare items. As noted, these are generally old items, vintage things, etc. Technically, in some sense, these can often be reproduced, which kind of undercuts their value. Still, we may hold that some cannot realistically be reproduced, and that there is some sense of desire for wanting the original, so to speak. The barterer utilizes the relative rarity of such things to, in essence, create wealth, understood as the desire of others to want said things. Bluntly, having some rare things that are desirable entails the capacity to trade those rare things for lots of other things. One aspect of the concern here is that the barterer who deals in rare things doesn't thereby give those things away for free. Such in at least some sense runs up against the Moneyless Free Labor Society. To try and be clear on the point, there are masses of abundance of material goods and services which really are not rare, and which legitimately can be effectively dealt with via head nodding of agreement within a moneyless free labor society. However, there are some things that are actually rare, desirable, etc., that are not obviously able to be effectively traded within the moneyless free labor society. Gift-giving does go a fair way towards addressing this. However, bartering as the very basic metric of an individual trading some good or service they have for some other good or service someone else has implies relative valuation of goods and services. Consider such in the current antique stores. How popular are they really? I mean, there isn't exactly a huge rush on these things. Which doesn't mean they don't exist and aren't valuable to people, but how overblown is the concern really? If antique dealers are also in the free labor market, would there really be a massive rush on these places? Wherein the monetary value of those items are null, the actual value being in their relative rarity, and yet not really in their usefulness as such, would people really, I mean, beyond whatever adjustment period wherein people may be confused about such things. Hence, perhaps it is the case that there are antique dealers, dealers in rare things, etc., and yet such is but another series of goods and services provided within the moneyless free labor market. Likewise, the various markets for gamer goods, dorkdom, nerddom, the various products that are far more about the fun and enjoyment of doing something than any particular utility as such. These have an aspect of non-purposefully produced rarity to them. Note the massive amount of freely produced products of exactly that sort, which fairly well undercuts those kinds of concerns. If, after all, that rare comic book is freely given away, there would be an expected rush upon it to get it. The first-come, first-served principle. To which, there is no real reason why not to do such a thing. However, the savvy barterer understands that there are a lot of bidders for that particular prize, and hence exactly does barter for the rare comic book. Such does present an element of actual rarity, even if it were undercut by the reality that the rare comic book can technically be reproduced. Therein there is a certain sense of pragmatics involved to suggest, well, what does such a person barter for? After all, if they are dealing in rare comic books, are they not likely to continue to barter within the realm of rare comic books? In other words, such a person is likely to barter within the game they are participating in. They may of course barter beyond that, but such bartering would amount to bartering between in-game variations of economies of the imagination. In some very meaningful sense, harmless play. Do they also potentially barter in the non-harmless world? Yes. Though again, even the barterer has access to all the available goods and services. So for what exactly is it that they are bartering for that isn't also an in-game exchange? That particular point is perhaps the most sound kind of response. The barterer does also have access to all the relevant goods and services within a moneyless free labor society. Hence bartering for things that are not in-game doesn't really make a lot of sense for the barterer. Though note the potential usefulness for the barterer to motivate and move goods and services around that might not otherwise be so moved. The issues therein run rather disturbingly deep. The playing upon emotion, at least in-game. Such also touches relevantly on the notions of competition as a supposed valuable thing, in this case, the competition to acquire things in-game through bartering. Purposely produced rarities. Consider again the points in luxury goods, absent the moneyed value of such things, there is still perhaps an interest in the rare, unusual, etc., but without there being any particular monetary need being fulfilled, nor for that matter, any particular practical need to be fulfilled, is it really the case that such would be a major point? Again, regarding relatively rare materials, classically valuable materials, that particular question is largely answered via the hands of labor that produce said materials. Mining it out of the ground, which is very hard and dangerous labor, generally very damaging to the local environment, is something labor isn't inclined to do without there being some good to the overall community. Purposely produced rarities, saturated markets. This has a few aspects to it worth considering as regards to how serious this kind of bartering concern really is. The plausible increase in hobbies, craft goods and services entails that the relatively unique and rare items, handcrafted goods and so forth, original art pieces, are saturating the market. In a saturated market of rare goods, the relative rarity of the goods is actually markedly diminished, hence undercutting the premise that the skilled barterer is working with. Moreover, the advent of video games and role-playing games with all their various in-game rare items further saturates the market. It is fairly difficult, in other words, to convince people aside from the fun of such in-game rarities that these kinds of things have any real value to them. Again, it may be fun to play such things within those in-game markets, but to pretend such things outside those in-game markets is fairly silly. Which isn't to suggest that such playfulness lacks real value either. They are the kinds of things the species enjoys doing. The savvy barterer who negotiates towards the mere accumulations of things within a moneyless free labor society is perhaps doing little good for themselves. After all, in the moneyless free labor society all the various things are freely given. One may perhaps sum a response to this sort of concern as follows. Much like any other laborer, the barterer has incentives to do the things that they do in exchange for access to all available goods and services within the society. The relative rarity of the thing they may be bartering with only entails that it has someone's willing to accept the gift. The barterer isn't really in much a different position than the craftsperson, in the sense that what they are bartering is unique, or relatively unique. The value of it is in at least some sense because of its uniqueness. In the case of, for instance, unique theories, or at any rate, relatively unique theories, the gift-giving may entail other kinds of intangible benefits, and always has. The value of the barterer is in their capacity to help distribute goods and services that might not otherwise be so distributed. Their motivation to do so is in at least some sense a bit odd, depending on the circumstances that the barterer is working with. Such touches upon some of the issues related to pointless advertising, pushy sales tactics, and purposefully selling useless goods and services. Insofar as the barterer isn't really dealing with the issues of rarity, uniqueness, etc., but rather, the role they may play simply as a matter of bartering, providing the platforms, for instance, for bartering, the marketplaces, or the more literal sense of a person actively trading with various people such that they thereby more efficiently distribute the goods and services, such can be understood as valuable. In the current, for instance, the virtual marketplaces and also the non-virtual marketplaces provide a service for people in that they provide a venue. They require labor to upkeep, stock the shelves, maintain the online platforms, and so forth. There is exactly zero reason therein to suppose that they thereby deserve any greater share of the goods and services. More pointedly, however, there are no greater shares than exactly what is being proposed: free access to all goods and services. When there's nothing left to give, to paraphrase the poets, killing it with kindness, the dog days are over. The individual, small-time barterer, who skews those larger-scale structures and, say, has a more personal touch to the matter, bartering between individuals, families, communities, etc., ought be understood in the same way. Again, the labor they are doing reduces the labor associated with others maintaining the various marketplaces. Fewer people utilizing the latter because they are utilizing the former entails less labor on the part of people who are utilizing the latter. Of course, as with other aspects, and not particularly different from the current, people will tend towards the utilization of those kinds of services that require less labor, or towards those kinds of services that provide for relative rarity, uniqueness, etc. The local craftspeople, farmers, etc., going to the local market to distribute their goods and services, after all, are fairly well thought of by most everyone. Doing so under the auspices of thereby gaining access to all the local goods and services entails very likely an increase in everyone's access to such things. They are contributing to the overall production and distribution of the various goods and services. Advertising realism. The role of advertisement to induce people to buy the various goods and services is a significant part of the issue involved when it comes to overconsumption. Such is strongly related to earlier responses to the barterer in that adverts emotional manipulation, manipulation in general, as well as honest adverts actually entails some non-insignificant aspect of the barterer's role. Advertisements work. This ought not be a secret. When the aim of businesses is to sell as much as possible, the role of advertisements becomes perverse. They actively seek out people as a means of selling their goods, as a means of inducing within people a desire to buy goods and services. The delimiting of adverts is in a meaningful sense its own issue as regards overconsumption. It is hardly reasonable to actively propagandize people to overconsume and then wonder at why it is that they are doing so. Lose the propaganda, and so too goes some meaningful degree of overconsumption. In this regard, we may note that such delimiting of adverts may have far more to do with adverts that originate from without a given bioregion. It is one thing, after all, to inform people of what is available locally. It is a very different thing to advert to people to purchase from beyond their local bioregion. It isn't as if basic adverts aren't relevant, it is that being cognizant and honest about what they do is also relevant. Perhaps more to the point, in a moneyless free labor society the disposition to advertise is significantly lessened. Again, there needn't be some from on high dictum about the matter, so much as noting that generally people aren't going to be selling crap goods to survive in the first place, and they don't have any particular incentive to advertise their goods and services to people en masse in order to survive. See also interbioregional trade. Closing on the Barterer. There is a rather cynical interpretation of the Barterer, that they don't particularly do anything at all save moving other people's products of production around. That is, that the entirety of their role is to find ways of taking the hard work of someone else, acting as if it were their own, and moving it around to other people. I don't tend to take such a belittling and dim view of the barterer, the merchant, the seller of goods and services. There is something altogether intriguing on a rather basic level about the species' capacity to move the fruits of labor around, that they can alter the environment within which they live. Nonetheless, the reality is that such is about all they really do. The increase in value they provide is simply through the movement of goods and services. Nothing more, nothing less. Folks can dress it up howsoever they like, but thus it is. What I do take a dim view of is the pretentious propensity of the barterer to pretend as if they are doing something more than that. How they pretend they are owners of the fruits of others, owners of the labors of others, indeed owners of others themselves. All in virtue of, in essence, a somewhat trite capacity to move those goods and services around, albeit in an organized manner. The merchant classes, who play pretend with imaginary things, making invisible markings upon the lands, upon the people, upon the fruits of labors, upon anything they can, the brandishing of branding brand names as if they were themselves things, as if they were brand new, freshly minted from their own whimsical whimsies. That they wish, poorly so, that therefore they deserve more. The vanquishing of such desires, the remuneration of such wistful wishings in the form of equitable distribution systems, freely given goods and services by all, for all. What then say thee? Silence.